Okay, hi everybody. Um, so today's the first day I ever called what I did a model. After 43 years, I've never called it a model, but now I am. So now I have a model, and I'm going to tell you about it. So one of the things that happened was I started working at a battered women's shelter in 1978, and it had opened in 77. And there was a little piece of research that was done. And we looked at women who had been in the shelter and what happened to them a year after they left. And we found that over 80% of the women that we could find had returned to the person who abused them. Now, in the 70s, there were no laws, there was no emergent aid, there were a lot of issues that were very systemic for women who had left at that time. But our executive director, Jerry Staley, who was very farsighted, said, if they're going back, if the women and kids are going back, we need to create a program for their partners so that maybe they'll go back to something that's safer. Now, at that time, I was hired to do the program. I didn't want to do it. I worked with the victims, and I didn't want to work with the person who abused them. But I was a single mom with 2 kids, and I needed the big bucks. So I said, okay, I'll do the program development. But at a shelter, if you're doing the program development, you're doing the program. And there were some things that were really important to me at the beginning. One was that we often create policy and programming without talking to the people who are most affected by it. And so I went to the women at our shelter. So some of the unique aspects were that it happened to be, I founded the program in 1979, Alternatives to Violence, was one of the first programs in the country. I communicated with, at that time, Emerge, Vibes, Tabs, and Ann Ganley's program, which was at American Lake, a veterans hospital. It was actually a residential program at American Lake in Washington State. And they all wrote to me about doing programs that were fundamentally based on the premise that patriarchy caused domestic violence. When I went and spoke to the women at our shelter, and I said, what do I need to know about your partners? And what do you think I should include in a program? And they overwhelmingly said, our partners grew up in violent families, and you need to do something about that. So we became trauma informed without knowing the word trauma informed from the beginning. We began doing things that, and in fact, I used some of the exercises that we used with battered women, I used with perpetrators, I adapted them. I will tell you that at that time, there were no curriculum. I did not go to school to be a therapist. I went to be a school to be a community change agent, whatever that is. And I actually became one because I worked at the shelter. So that was cool. But part of what happened was that we needed to start looking not only at the fact that these guys were violent, not only looking at the fact that patriarchy affected that, and definitely, I think of patriarchy and racism and homophobia and all the isms as sort of smog that we all breathe, that affects all of us in different ways. But that the other thing we had to look at was what people learned, and that what they could learn, they could unlearn. So I had, as I said, I had no counseling experience, but I came from a family where we all love each other, and we got along, and there was a certain democracy in a healthy family where as you get older, you have more of a voice. I thought that would be important for the men in group to learn about power sharing. I thought that a male-female team might be really effective. These were just ideas, but we put them all into place. And so we were one of the first groups to actually do male-female teams. Most of the groups, Emerge was doing male facilitators, and Vibes and Tab were female, and Ann Ganley's group was female. So I thought not only, and those groups, by the way, at the time were like around 6 weeks to 16 weeks. They were fairly short-term groups. And so we went to 6 months, and then we went to a year. And that was before anything was in our law in California. So we were doing non-court ordered groups. They were groups where we had referrals from shelters, from shelter hotlines. But initially I was sort of an undercover op. And the men in our, that were in relationship to the women in our shelter were contacted with a number to call me. And so that's how we initially got clients. Now, the other thing is we were very community-based. We had to, at the time, people were not dealing with this, did not know how to work. And in fact, our clinical director and members of our board who also worked on the formation of the program said, we don't know how to work with this population. So, and we can't really supervise you because we don't know how to work with this population. So fortunately, and Paul can relate to this, I'm from New Jersey and I have a certain adolescent omnipotence. And so I thought, oh, I can do this. And we wound up creating a program with a male-female team that was trauma-informed, that was a year long, where we had referrals from all over the community because I had to market the program. And so I met with judges, I met with probation, I met with the courts, I met with the police department, I met with the mental health and social service agencies, I went to the churches, we went to the garden clubs and the Rotary. So we basically thought, if this is going to work, we need community buy-in and community support, but we also need accountability. And once again, there were no laws in California until 1980. So we started with that basic premise. So there are some unique features, other unique features, I think, in terms of what we do. One is that we have men who stay in our program. So right now, for instance, in my West LA group, we have 3 new men. We have 6 men who've been in the program over 3 years. And we have 2 men who've been in the program over 10 years. We do an unstructured program. The men bring in issues that when we come in, for instance, if I come in with an exercise I want to do, and I have this great, glorious idea, but the men have something that's more relevant to them, it's their group. And I tell them that. And we're in California, so we, from the very early years had TV crews that wanted to come in, film the group, that kind of thing. The men in group get to decide whether that happens or not. There's a certain democracy in the group that happens. We wanted a male-female team because we wanted to model what we wanted to see with the guys. We wanted to model a respectful, healthy relationship between a man and a woman, where we could disagree with each other and still be fine, and we could disagree in a healthy way, where the facilitators were grist for the mill, so that the men could confront us if there was something they needed. One of the things we believe is that if you can ask for what you want, it diminishes your need for power and control. So, for instance, if men want to be sure to talk, we ask them, be sure to talk, be sure to say, I want to talk tonight, if we don't have time to get to you. So we do check-ins, but we want to make sure that we're dealing with issues, and I'll get into that in my later session. One of the other things that's unique about our program is that we have victim contact 80 to 90% of the time. And that evolved because when I worked at the shelter, I knew what was going on. I had the women and the kids there. Oftentimes we would have hospital reports, medical reports. Sometimes we would have police reports. But I knew things that were happening. When I met with the men for an intake, I would hear a very different story. And I knew that to be able to adequately both assess dangerousness, but also to actually tailor my interventions to the specific person and group, I needed to be able to know what was actually going on. For instance, we could find out that a weapon was used from the partner in group in the shelter or the survivor, and we might not ever find out about it from the man in group. We would find out about different forms of abuse. We would find out about controlling behaviors or psychological coercive controlling behaviors. We would find out about isolation, very important kinds of information that we would get from the survivor that we could use during the course of group. So, and by the way, there was a book that I thought was really important when I started the program. And that book was called Learning to Live Without Violence. I still think it's a great workbook. It's by Dan Sonkin and Mike Durfee. It's Volcano Press, which you might have to, I don't know if Volcano's still in operation, but it was a mother and son operation, and they were terrific. But they dealt with things. That was where I got time out. And we do a very, very enhanced form of timeout, which once again, I'll go over the intake in my session. And I'm not sure how much time I have. Steve, are you moderating this? How much time do I have left?
I didn't know that I was moderating this, but go ahead and keep talking. And
oh, okay, I'll go.
Yeah.
By the way, if people have questions, please jump in. And that's what we tell folks in group too. Please jump in. Some of the work that we did early on was to ask people about their histories, which we did in the intake. So we would have a sense, an intergenerational sense of violence, but we would also, in the intake, our attempt was to build hope, to start on working with empathy, to start people believing that they had choice, because the more choices they have, the more power they have. For people to have a tool that they could use whether or not they ever returned, because initially we would have people come once and then they would not come back again. We just thought we did wonderful work. We found out that wasn't true, but they would get the famous one session cure where they would show up for an intake, sort of emotionally barf, feel better about it, and then they wouldn't come back. So it took a little while to start building. And our first group were two clients and two facilitators. We called it a group because there were 4 of us. And the 2 clients, one of them was a very blue collar guy who bowled for money, and the other was a Beverly Hills realtor. So we started, that's another thing, because we have a wealth of people who refer to us, we have very ethnically, socioeconomically, racially different kinds of groups. And in fact, we have had trans women in our group who the court found were socialized as men, were raised as men, were just doing their transitions, and they felt that they should be in, and they were convicted of domestic violence as men. So we have worked with a diversity, and we're one of the few groups. In LA County, there are over 100 batterer intervention groups.
Alyce?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that there is enough time for all the presenters. And
I'm fine with that, Dave.
okay, and we can work to have questions towards the end, I think.
Okay.
And really anyone who has questions beyond what we have time for, you all have the ability, once this session is over, after there'll be a 15-minute break, to go into the room with the presenters and go in depth more. So if we could move on, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Alyce, if we could move
Oh,
on to
no,
the
no
next.
problem. That's what I was saying. Yeah, I'm unaware of time. That's great.
Thank you. Who's going next?
Jessica, I'm not sure you were with us in our meeting when we were discussing the order of presentations, but if you would like to present next, I'd love to listen to what you have to say.
No problem. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Nunan, and I am the co-CEO of Caminar Latino Unite for Peace and Equity. And so we'll just make this part more conversational, and then I can always pull out the PowerPoint later. But again, so we have been working in the community for over 30 years. And similar, we have never considered what we do basically a model. We've always called it an approach. What we have always said is what may have worked for us here in Atlanta, Georgia, may not be a good fit for other communities. And it was more along the lines of how our program came to be. And so over the past 32 years, I would say that we first started off as in response to a need for a Spanish-speaking support group. And so for Latina survivors. And at that time, again, we thought the issue was just language. And so if we created a support group that would convince the survivors to leave, then basically the problem would be solved. And so I'm sure everybody who has been involved, you know, in the area of domestic violence knows and how amusing that is now to think that it was only language and that the solution to domestic violence was just to convince people to leave and everything would be okay. And so shortly after we started our work with survivors, what we realized is that one, we were transferring the power, even though we weren't knowingly doing it. We are transferring the power from those who are using violence to ourselves. And what we mean by that is that we basically felt that we knew what was best for them in their situation. And so as a result, again, it was that idea of, okay, the solution to the problem is to leave your partner. And so our work with survivors, we were very lucky where the survivors really started being honest in terms of what they needed. And so that was when we started seeing them as the survivors, and us being our role was to walk with them on their journey towards nonviolence. So that's what Caminar Latino means roughly or loosely, is that we see our role is to walk with families on their journey towards nonviolence. And so in 1993, basically the survivors told us that we didn't just need to offer childcare, but we also needed to have services specific to their children who had been exposed to violence. And so that was how we started. A couple of years after that, the survivor said, hey, we really appreciate everything you're doing, but unfortunately, it doesn't make sense for only half of this couple to really know or to know about domestic violence. And for a variety of different reasons, they didn't want to leave their partner. Instead, they just wanted the violence to stop. And so that was when they asked us to start working with their partners. And back in 1995, the idea of having one program that worked with each part of the family, even though we weren't doing family therapy, but again, having programming for each part in a domestic violence program brought a lot of concern and a lot of fear. Because again, what we were proposing was to basically have each part of the family all come to one place at the same time and each receive or each attend their own intervention prevention groups. And so there was a lot of backlash, and some from our community partners, and it was valid, it was warranted in terms of that. But again, sticking to the idea of seeing the survivors as the experts, we really pushed forward and started working with men at that time, men who were using violence. Because again, what we knew for a fact is that a lot of these survivors were staying with their partners. And so it just made more sense in terms of basically working with each part of the family versus the silo approach. I think that in terms of what has made us unique since then is that one of the things that we have that's been known for is, again, our comprehensive programming for Latino families. So again, we have services for survivors, for their children, as well as individuals who use violence. What that looks like today is that we have here in Georgia what's called a Certified Family Violence Intervention Program, one for males, one for females, understanding that even though people don't like to talk about it, sometimes survivors can use violence more oftentimes against their children, but at the same time making sure that we are addressing violence because we're looking for families that are safer overall and not just focusing on one. I think another thing that has made us unique is that two of the facilitators who facilitate our program were originally participants. And so again, going into the way that we've always seen it is that our founder, Dr. Julia Padilla, even though she had letters behind her name, what she always said is that while letters behind her name was nice, at the same time, what was much more important was that people were able to connect with whoever was facilitating. And so by having men who had gone through this, who had been abusive in the past, and them being able to connect with our current participants made much more of a difference versus whether or not somebody had letters behind their name. And so that is something that we have always really focused on is not just credentials, but instead the ability to really honor and value the lived experience and the impact and the value of community. Another thing is that for us, what we realized is that our role was not a punitive one. And what we mean by that is that what we quickly learned is that if we just simply worked with the individuals, worked with men, and basically said, don't use violence because it's against the law, then you weren't going to have lasting impact. It wasn't going to create sustainable change because all that would happen is that our participants would then learn and how to use violence in a way that it was harder for law enforcement or the courts or the justice system in order to hold them accountable for. And so as a result, instead, what we really started focusing on was realizing that this, for a lot of our participants, was the first time that they had ever talked about their use of violence. And also the fact that they often grew up in a house where there was violence happening. And so as a result, it wasn't so much that they wanted to be violent because they also had memories, but instead, when it came to conflict, they had never been given the skills or the opportunity to talk about healthy conflict resolution and what were other ways to really address it. And so we really kind of focused on what was important to them. And again, coming from a cultural perspective, we worked with what made sense in the Latino culture. And for us, and this is not only unique in our culture, the idea of being a good father and being able to really kind of center our work around, if they want to be good fathers, how did that relate to them using violence against their mom or both of themselves? And then also in terms of really kind of holding on to the positive aspects of our culture, but also addressing patriarchy, which, in ours was called machismo, but, it was just a different word to basically discuss the same issue. And so what we found is that by providing a space that always held them accountable, so we never let them use their upbringing. We never let them use their upbringing or the use of alcohol or anything like that as an excuse for their violence. We always treated them with respect because what we found is that if they came in and they started and they felt like they were being treated horrendously or that they weren't being respected, we weren't going to be the ones who were going to be punished. Instead, they're going to do what they need to do because, again, we have a relationship with the courts and the majority were court mandated to attend. And so they weren't going to do anything against us, but there was a very good chance that they would go home and they would take it out on their partner or their children. So instead, what made a lot more sense was to basically work with them in a manner where we acknowledge their use of violence, we held them accountable for it, but we also realized that for the majority of our participants, they were a lot more than just their use of violence. And this made a big difference in terms of the way in which the men viewed us. And so I think that I can definitely go into more detail, but I think that overall, what we have found in our 27-year history of working with individuals who use violence is that addressing in a way that really kind of takes into account the role of culture, the impact of culture, and also making a program that addresses the whole person and not just the use of violence has really made a big impact in terms of the way that we're viewed, the way in which our support is seen, and the way in which we're able to operate both internally and externally. So I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of this or in the breakout session. But again, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Jessica. So we have about 2 minutes for any questions for Jessica. All righty. I'm going to take this time to ask a question to Alyce that was on the chat previously. Let me scroll back up to it. Miss Olivia had asked Alyce, how did you get the judge, attorney, DOC to buy into your program at the start?
Oh, okay. Well, I had lunch with them, and there were several in each group. There were people that were totally not interested, but there were always several people in each group that were. And I brought those groups together and we met more regularly. And they were really interested. And for a while we had domestic violence dedicated courtrooms, which were terrific. But we had, like, there were 3 police officers out of a huge department that were very interested in working with us. And so I would find these places, and then domestic violence was such, in terms of the criminal justice system, such a major call. They were getting a lot of calls on that. And the other thing was that in every group I spoke to, there were people who said, I had this in my marriage. When I spoke to the church women's group, there would be at least 4 or 5 women who were elderly who would come up and say, I had this, I had no place to go. And so we got a lot of support from community groups. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Alyce. And there was one more for you, Alyce. How did you ensure safety for those women in your groups?
Oh, for the trans women, we don't have women in our groups. In California, you can't. But the trans women that we had in our groups, we actually, and we did the same thing because we have gay men in our groups. We met with the group first and talked about how to provide a safe space. And were they able to do it? And let's talk about your bias. Let's talk about your feelings about it. And so we did a whole group about that first. And we also thought if men in the program could understand one oppression, it was much easier to understand others. So we actually, with the trans women, I have to tell you, the men in group were like the welcome wagon. They did everything but give them free car wash tickets. They were very gentle. So it worked out very well.
Thank you, Alyce.
You're welcome.
We've got time for one more question for Jessica or Alyce. Okay, great. So up next, we're going to have Chris go up next. And then after that, we'll have Mr. Halley.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually share my screen here and rocket through a bunch of slides, which you all will have access to. So don't worry. One thing I want to note, and this is not the first time I've observed this, is I'm struck by the consistency of the programs. I would say that I'm agreeing with just about every single thing that both Jessica and Alyce were saying in terms of the work that I've done. It's just amazing how we come out independently. We kind of do our own takes. There's a striking level of convergence. And hopefully you'll experience that as well when I kind of outline a little bit what's being done at Allies and Change. That's the feedback I've gotten. So just very briefly, my agency is a 501c private nonprofit. We publicly present as a counseling center, as an outpatient counseling center. And that's done on purpose because in part we're trying to work with voluntary clients as well. So we do individual and couples counseling not related to domestic violence, but most of our programming is related to doing abuse intervention work. We have almost 30 groups a week for abusive partners. We have groups for men, we have groups for women, and we also have one multi-gender LGBTQ plus group as well. And our groups meet weekly for 90 minutes. They're open groups, so we add people regularly, and they're open-ended. Typically, the length of stay is in the area of 9 to 15 months for court-involved folks. For voluntary folks, it can be even longer. And another point of pride for me, about 75 of our group members, of our program members, are voluntary, and I think that's more than any other program in the country. And a little bit about the Allies and Change model is I've been in this field for 30 years. So I started back in '92. However, this curriculum is actually older than me in this field. It's been cooking for about 40 years. I first started my work back in '92 in Portland, Oregon with an agency called Men's Resource Center. And they'd already been doing groups for abusive men for about 10 years, since the early '80s. And they were one of the first providers in Oregon. And then in my career, I've kind of I learned this curriculum and have shepherded it along and helped it evolve and expand. And Allies and Change has been in business for now actually 18 years. Got founded in 2004. And so this is a well used curriculum. There's been dozens and dozens of folks who have used this kind of orientation. As well as been used with thousands and thousands of abusive partners. And so it's kind of, I think, well tested. So the basic core, and I'll go into some more detail in the breakout session later, is that actually we identify 3 drivers of abusive behavior. Typically, the traditional analysis is one, it's about power and control. We actually suggest there are 3, and they all involve people working against. They work against themselves by disconnecting from themselves. They work against others in general by not being aware of them, by disregarding them. And they work against the relationship, their primary relationship, by distrusting it. And typically, in my experience, most abusive partners can relate to all 3 of these. They can check all 3 of these boxes, but they may be different mixes of how much they kind of resonate with each one. And so the disconnecting from self means not being self-aware, and as a result, knowing how to self-soothe very well and self-managing very well. And so they don't handle their distress very well, and they end up externalizing it or acting it out. Disregarding others is really about being neglectful in relationship, and distrusting the relationship means you need to control the other to keep them in line. Okay. So on the positive side, the idea is to help them shift from working against to working with, to work with themselves by connecting with themselves, to work with others by being mindful of them and regarding them, and to work with their close relationships, like with a romantic partner, by trusting and learning to trust and being trusting. So connecting with themselves by becoming more self-aware and better managing themselves, regarding others by becoming more relational, and to practice humility. So kind of getting out of this idea that you're the only one in the room, and to get kind of out of their little egotistical bubble, to kind of be mindful of the people around them, and trusting intimate relationships by becoming collaborative, how to work collaboratively in partnership, as opposed to trying to dominate and control. So the other, besides kind of the conceptualization and the curriculum that flows from that, I think the other noteworthy thing about our groups is the structure. And some of this, again, will sound similar a little bit what you've already heard, and we'll hear from other programs as well. There are 3 basic parts to our group process. Every week, there's a checking in process. We'll explain a little bit more. There's a focusing on specific issues that group members are struggling with. including using journals, which is the primary homework assignment we require, and then there's an educational piece. So those are kind of the 3 parts of the group each week. So one really key thing, and in terms of what I would say is most important about what we do at Allies and Change and more distinctive, is a check-in board. And the check-in board is a grid of questions that when they're in person, it was actually up on a whiteboard. They'd actually fill in the line. Online, we have them access a Google Doc, and then the whole group looks at the responses. And that really is kind of a way of helping frame that, we aren't just hanging out together for an hour and a half. We're here to talk about how to be non-abusive and non-controlling and how to practice that. And this is what our check-in board looks like. And this, again, has evolved over the years. So this was present from the first day that I learned how to do abuse intervention work, but it has evolved a little bit. And again, for time's sake, I don't have time to go into this right now. I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in the breakout session. But they do this every week. And so this is one organizing principle. So once everybody's filled this out, and they typically do this as they're entering the room, the whole group discusses it. So what questions y'all have for each other, things you're wondering about? Hey, Jim, I noticed that you've got some verbal abuse this week. What was your verbal abuse? Hey, Ronaldo, I noticed that you've got a life change. Can you tell us what your life change was this week? And so it's a way of kind of grounding the group into relevant material. And you can see the key, the explanations for it there. So that's, I think, one really important part of it. Kind of consistent with what Alyce was talking about. That way we can really zero in on what are the pressing issues of the day. What are the things that are challenging them this week? And that becomes the basis for our teaching. So it's much more present focused as opposed to static, if you will. The second kind of key thing is journal sharing. In our program, group members have to complete 50 journals. And the journals are like questionnaires, and you'll see one here in just a moment what it looks like that they need to do. And the journals are kind of the other kind of key part of this. So this is a journal. It's actually about 2 pages long. And this is a fill in the blank kind of thing. And they can do this in any kind of situation. They can do it on present day situations they're dealing with. They can do it on situations from the past, from a year ago, 5 years ago. They can also do it on situations where they handle things well. So it doesn't have to just be when they were abusive and controlling. It could be a situation where they navigated that well. This may look like a lot, and it can be intimidating initially, but in my experience, even illiterate, so-called illiterate group members are able to fill this out over time. They don't have to use complete sentences. They don't have to write in paragraphs. And so we find that even with people who have low literacy, and because they're hearing these are often presented in the group verbally, typically every week, 1 or 2 group members are going to read a journal out loud that the whole group is going to discuss. Just the listening to them, they learn what the different categories are. And each of these sections is relevant in terms of some of the earlier points I were making. So there are a few ways that I would say that we are somewhat different than some programs. And again, I don't think we're unique at all, and I don't want to convey that. I think that most of what we do, some other programs do as well. But I do want to say some things that I think are more important in terms of kind of what I've learned over the years. One is we don't have a lot of homework assignments. We have mainly one homework assignment they do a lot of times. We do have a couple final assignments that they do, but those are also primarily verbal presentations. And a couple concerns around homework assignments. One is they can be biased against people who do not have as much formal education or who don't learn so well that way. It also can get pretty abstract. A lot of homework assignments can be pretty in your head and not so much grounded in real life. We don't talk as much about the past and about one's history. We, of course, talk a little bit about people's past abuse. We talk a little bit about people's upbringing, but mainly what we care about and what we want our group members to care about is how are you behaving now? What are you doing now? How are you dealing with life in the present day? And when are you tempted to be abusive and controlling? When are you choosing to be abusive and controlling now? And how can you navigate that differently? So we're primarily present focused, if you will. Again, a lot of the group learning is grounded in real life, actual situations that people are dealing with. So it's not hypothetical or abstract as much. It's much more rooted in examples. So yes, one group member will share their journal and get input, but really they're serving as an example for all the group members. So a ton of learning can be done without having to say a lot, just by listening to what other people are doing and struggling with. And then another way that in my 30 years, I'm evolving in my own thinking is I used to think, of course, I have a doctorate, so I had lots of formal education. I like teaching, so I used to think the curriculum was so important. And what I've realized increasingly is what's more relevant is not all the abstract teaching. It's the actual application of the concepts. And in fact, the people who have to know the curriculum the best are the facilitators. And that's a matter of how do you apply these concepts in real life. So a lot of this is,
Chris, sorry.
3 minutes. Great, thank you.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Great,
Yes.
thank you. Yes, because I'm not monitoring chat. So thank you, Ida. So so I think a part of this is the way they learn these concepts is not by doing a lot of reading or us doing a half-hour lesson. It's about how they actually manifest in day-to-day real-life situations. It's much more naturalistic learning, if you will. Okay. And so to that point, again, similar to what I heard Alyce saying about her groups, a lot of the group is spent in discussion. And I know the Duluth curriculum also emphasizes this as well, among other programs, is it's less about lecturing and more about dialogue and exchange and people offering each other input. And what we're really trying to do, I think the key to stopping abusive behavior among individuals is not about stopping particular behaviors, it's shifting the way they think and the way they live in the world. It's really about developing a non-abusive lifestyle. And in that way, I think it's a lot like sobriety. And I'm not saying it's an addiction. I do not think it's an addiction. But just as sobriety is more than just not drinking and using, it's living a sober lifestyle. I think being non-abusive is not just not being abusive, it's living a non-abusive lifestyle. I also think it's akin to developing a trade or developing a professional degree. So, again, my training taught me to think like a mental health professional. My thinking pre-graduate school compared to postgraduate school is significantly different that way. And what I would suggest is that's what we're trying to do with our group members, ideally and aspirationally, is shift the way they think about the world. Because I think what drives their abusive behavior is a worldview. All right. And so I kind of made those points. So a few last things. Again, besides the 1 hour breakout I'll be doing in a little bit, if you'd like to learn more, twice a year we offer a 4-day, 27-hour training on Zoom. The next one's coming up in October. So you're welcome to register for that. And through the Allies and Change website, there's a link to how to register for that training. It's $400 and you can get CEUs for it if you need CEUs. I also want to mention a couple books. We do have a group manual, which is more expensive. That's for the facilitators and that covers our entire curriculum and our group structure that you can purchase from us. And then the other thing I want to do more of a shout out for is the book Becoming Allies. Alyce mentioned Learning to Live Without Violence, which was the first book that I ever saw around domestic violence way back in the day. And that's no longer in print. My hope and aspiration is this will be a worthy successor to that. And this is more of a textbook. And it's a thick book. It's almost 500 pages. It's not particularly expensive. And intentionally, we made it as inexpensive as possible. But it really covers, a lot of the basic material about what is abuse, what is control, things of that nature. So this is actually intended for abusive partners. So it's not, obviously, if you're a facilitator, you can read it. And a lot of the early readers of this have been actually people running groups or in programs. So it's good for you all, but it's actually intended for the group members. And also for people who are not yet in group programming. So people out there who need to be in group programming, who are struggling with this, but who are not yet engaged in services. So that's the other thing. And I think that may be it. So this is contact information for me. And I think I'm done just about on time.
Yes, you have 2 questions.
Okay.
One from Derek. Derek was asking, do you have the check-in board in Spanish?
No, we don't. That's a great question. We do not. But obviously, if you're providing culturally specific services, you're welcome to modify and adapt anything in our curriculum, not only literally translating it, but also in terms of not only the literal language used, but the way it's conveyed that's culturally relevant. I think that's really important, actually. So.
All righty, and your next question was, is that a book they can do with their partners, or is it something to be done on their own?
No, it's not a workbook. It's actually more like a textbook. And so it's for them to read to better understand themselves and these issues. Honestly, we have had some survivors read the book, even though it's written for abusive partners. And I think the survivors have also found it pretty validating for their own lived experiences. Basically, the first half of the book is all about the problem, so different types of abuse, the denial, the justifications, the lack of empathy and awareness. So that's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is really about the change process, if you will.
Okay.
And then I saw this new question. So our program is open-ended. Now, here's the deal, and I really want to echo Alyce's point of grounding this in the survivor experience. So to me, the gold standard of doing this work is that the abused partners who are still in the abusive relationship, where there's change happening, that they and their children feel consistently safe and seen in the home. And based on the input I get regularly from survivors, I think involvement needs to be 2 to 3 years, typically, if you're using their lived experience. And there's more I could say, but I know I'm at time. So thank you
And
very
one
much.
last question, how many weeks or classes is your curriculum?
It's open-ended, so you can adapt it to whatever length. There's one provider that does it for 6 months, and so it's trimmed some. And again, I think the idea here is not that you should only use our curriculum. This is the best one out there. It's that this has value, but I think you can also draw and grab concepts from it and integrate it with what you're already doing. So you can use it as a standalone, but it doesn't need to be a standalone. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Chris. So up next, we have Steve.
Great, thank you. It's good to see you. And what an amazing opportunity just to listen to Jessica and Alyce and Chris. Thank you guys so much. And Chris, I agree. There's so much that is consistent what everybody is saying. It's really kind of remarkable how that's working out. The Family Peace Initiative is, I love telling the story of how it was created because my wife Dorothy was the visionary in creating this whole program. She was a director of a shelter program in Southeast Kansas, and she was confronted by the 6th victim of the same perpetrator back in 1989 or so, and she realized that we could be serving victims forever, but if we don't do something to intervene with those who are battering, we are not stopping this problem at all. And so she wrote a grant and got funded to start the program that was originally called Alternatives to Battering. It started in 1991. And I came into the picture in 1994, and I just, share with you, I was a probation officer. I was going to social work school at the University of Kansas. And in class, there was a student project being presented on this particular day, it was on domestic violence. And as a juvenile probation officer, I had no idea what domestic violence would have to do with me or the people that I was working with. I thought this was some other issue, and so I don't have to be interested until I looked up and saw the woman who was presenting on domestic violence. And I think I fell in love with her immediately, and as a result became so interested in the topic of domestic violence, not because of domestic violence, but because it was a possible avenue to a relationship that is ultimately, we're celebrating our 28th wedding anniversary here on the 3rd of July. I tell you all of that to tell you that I'm really honored to be here and privileged to be here because my humble beginnings was complete ignorance about domestic violence. I couldn't understand why she stayed. It took 2 to tango. And Dorothy has been incredibly patient with me along the way, helping me to learn the incredible complicated issues around domestic violence. And I can tell you confidently that I'm still on that learning curve as we talk today. We've traveled kind of an interesting road. We used some of the national models in the 90s. And I had a history of working with men long before I came to the field of domestic violence. And I knew that men had some real struggles with social supports. I knew that men had some real struggles with emotional expression. And And along the way in the 90s, I was kind of dabbling a little bit with, how do we increase social supports? How do we help people expand their ability to express themselves emotionally? And and as we built that system, we recognized that we had to make some changes to the way we were doing the program, because we were focused on accountability, ownership, and we were going to represent all victims in the world of domestic violence and try to hold these men accountable for their cruel behavior. And as we started learning about the men, learning about their stories, and understanding the impact and implications of trauma, we recognized that we had some very serious changes that we needed to make. And one of those was that we had to start focusing on creating a culture of safety for those who batter. And surprisingly, that wasn't a conversation that was really had among professionals in the field of how do you help those who are using cruelty to feel safe. Well, it turns out there's quite a bit of scientific evidence about that when you walk into polyvagal theory and the neurobiology of trauma and how people naturally protect themselves when they're afraid. And in controversial, confrontational environments, people are naturally afraid and naturally protect. And when we're afraid, we tend to not be introspective. It makes it more difficult for us to consider things. It's more difficult to hear opinions that are not consistent with our own. It limits us in our ability to consider. And so we started realizing that we had to create safety and a cruelty-free accountability for those that we were serving. How do we hold people accountable just like holding our son accountable in a loving, kind, compassionate way, but still not colluding with behavior, being able to communicate that behavior is not acceptable when it's cruel, when it's inflicting pain and suffering on others, or blatantly disregarding people in relationships. So as we moved into a more trauma responsive approach, we started asking people to do two things. We continued asking them to become accountable for all the cruel behaviors that they've used in their relationships. But we also began asking them to assume responsibility to begin the healing process from the trauma and cruelty that they've experienced long before they were ever cruel. And what we found over the years is that it's very hard to find a participant in our program who hasn't experienced remarkable cruelty in their life long before they were ever cruel to their partner, to their children, to people in their communities. And how do we be able to connect the dots and be able to show that the cruelty that we are using today as adults is evidence of unresolved cruelty in our lives, long before we were ever cruel to anyone? Now, there's arguments out there that there's plenty of people in our programs that have not experienced cruelty, and so that doesn't matter. And I would say that that is a subject for research. I think that it is weird if you have someone in your program who is not experienced cruelty growing up. I'm sure they're there, but we need to study and understand how they got there, because they are a fish out of water. They are different, and we need to learn about that better. Now, I'm not saying that cruelty in childhood causes violence. I'm not saying that it causes domestic violence. There's plenty of people out there who have experienced cruelty who have not gone on to be violent in relationships. And so that's not strange. It's much like smoking. There's plenty of people who have smoked for a long time who never got lung cancer, and that's okay. But among those who are battering, trauma and cruelty histories is really the norm. And so how do we use that in order to access an introspective examination of an internal focused conversation so that people can make transformational change? Because transformational change requires an internal focused conversation and internal focused perspective. And so how do we as facilitators use what's at our disposal to the most readily available create that internal focused dialogue to increase the odds of transformational change? So the FPI conceptual framework, right, we include, we have a lot of cognitive behavioral, what we call top-down approaches to the prefrontal cortex, logic, understanding, rational approaches. But I want to say that Bessel van der Kolk has a great quote. He says, the cognitive brain is basically inept at talking the emotional brain out of its reality. Right? We cannot cognitively, rationally talk people out of their trauma responses that are happening naturally. We have to create, in addition to the gender focused, in addition to the cognitive applications, we have to create a bottom-up approach that is about emotional activation, emotional soothing, emotional regulation, and experiencing and becoming aware of our bodies. Because the
Steve,
research
sorry to interrupt. You have 5 minutes.
Holy cow. Okay,
Sorry.
thanks, Ida. So what we have added to the cognitive approaches, to the attitudes and beliefs conversations, we have added a focus on regulating, helping people to regulate before we get into reasoning with them. We're helping people to feel safe, to where they have an element so that they can activate in polyvagal, their ventral vagal system of social engagement, where they're more open to be able to consider, more open to introspection, more open to really taking a look at shameful behaviors and difficult topics of conversation. Out of this trauma-focused growth, we developed the river of cruelty model. And the river of cruelty is simply an explanation of how cruelty is passed from person to person and generation to generation. And, we read Alice Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child. I would encourage you to read that book and relate to how cruelty is passed. She talks about cruelty. And as soon as I read that book, we went back to our programs and we really stopped talking about domestic violence. We started talking about cruelty in relationships that goes beyond just domestic violence. There's all types of forms of cruelty. And it was much easier for us to include emotional abuse and sexual abuse and a variety of behaviors when we started about cruelty instead of focusing simply on the topic of domestic violence. Domestic violence is one form of cruelty, but there's lots of different cruelties that people experience in their life that have impacts on them. And the river of cruelty model is an illustration of how this cruelty is passed on like a river from person to person and generation to generation. I've already mentioned the internal focused dialogue, which is really the requirement. Without an internal focused dialogue, without people being able to look at themselves in a safe and genuine, authentic fashion, transformational change is very, very difficult to create. And so how a facilitator is trained to be able to promote an internal focused dialogue is a really valuable skill for facilitators to acquire. In addition to all of this, long before I even walked into the relationship with Dorothy, having no idea what history was going to unfold for me while I just enjoyed the ride with her, Dorothy was already on the subject of different people who use cruel and violent behavior in relationships do so for different motives. And Dorothy was identifying that it's not a typology of behavior. Looking at battering behavior does not give us a good understanding of motive. Motive is what's driving the behavior, what's the energy behind the behavior that's making somebody punch their partner. And what she was able to show is that three people can have the same behavior and all three be using different motives in order to drive that behavior. And as victim advocates, as battery intervention facilitators, as anyone who works in the field of domestic violence, understanding motive is a huge step beyond painting everybody with the entitlement brush, that everybody's entitled and we have to address entitlement. There's lots of entitlement in there, and I'm not discounting that. But not all of those who batter are doing so from an entitlement perspective. And if we understand that, we're able to keep victims safer. We're able to be more effective when we're intervening in the room. The system as a whole is better able to make better decisions in domestic violence circumstances. So
1 minute,
1 minute, Ida?
1 minute.
Okay, I'll go fast. We wrote our recent curriculum in 2019, and we laugh, we're never going to write another one. That is a painstaking process. But it's the third edition of that, and we wrote it as a 27-week or a 52-week session. The curriculum, I really kind of agree with Chris is talking about. I think the curriculum is less important than I originally thought, but it gives a roadmap. And when we wrote ours, we were trying to create doorways and opportunities for introspection, because that's where the gold lies. And so how do you write activities, processes that will allow a skilled facilitator to access the opportunities that show up in those individual sessions that keep coming back to internal focused dialogue, that keep coming back to emotional awareness and awareness of body and awareness of beliefs and how those beliefs were fostered and created in our lives in the first place. Our program includes assessments. We screen out victims of domestic violence all the time who get caught up in the system, and they get ordered to come to an assessment, and we will screen them out. And it's a privilege to be able to protect victims in that way. But we're looking for patterns of domination control and looking for the biopsychosocial, mental health, drug and alcohol, child abuse history. We pursue victim contacts. The victims are, of course, voluntary. They can choose to not participate in the program, but we are pursuing them. And Alyce, when you said how many victim contacts you are getting in your program, you need to do a training on how you're making that happen, because that's stuff that we all need to know about. Congratulations on that. And of course, we work with the multiple community coordinated response in Kansas. There's so many different communities and jurisdictions, and we're working with the community coordinated responses as well. And I will stop there. Ida, how'd I do?
You went over about a minute, but we're okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. So we've got, we're gonna just take a few minutes into our break real quick. There's a few questions on the chat. Somebody answered the name of the book, Alice Miller and the Drama of the Gifted Child. What was the title of the book? Okay. In Virginia, we're mandated to make victim contact. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So before we go on our break, there was a question earlier by Karen to Alyce. Alyce, I'm gonna allow you to answer that real quick.
Sure. We do not generally take trans women into our groups. That was a very unusual situation. It happened twice. There was a lot of discussion with the judge, who was a really great judge, I have to say, about where there was no place for, it was either jail or a group. And so that we went through it, and she said, she doesn't fit in the victims group. She's not a victim. And the overriding issue was that she was convicted, both these women were convicted as male, and they had been socialized as male, and they both still had male entitlement, different gender experiences. And so that was why they went into a men's group. But before they ever came in, we met for 2 hours, our groups are 2 hours long. And we met for 2 hours going over, could we provide a safe place? Very unusual situation. It was not a typical one. In California, you have same gendered groups. So trans women now, we do have options. We have LGBTQ plus center in Long Beach and a big one in Los Angeles, and they now have groups. So that's, I hope nobody thinks that that's a general thing that we do, or that we would think that women should go in a men's group, because we don't.
Thank you, Alyce.
Thanks, Ida.
You're welcome.